In the mid-1300s, the plague didn't just kill people. It destroyed the most important engine of the economy, labor. Before the plague, Europe was overcrowded. There were more workers than jobs. Landowners, nobles, and elites controlled everything because labor was cheap and replaceable. If a farmer complained, he could be replaced. If a craftsman demanded more money, someone else would take his place. Human life had low economic value. Then the plague arrived. Within just a few years, 30 to 50% of the population was gone. Entire villages disappeared. Fields were left untouched. Workshops were silent. Cities were filled with empty houses instead of people. And suddenly, something shocking happened. The economy didn't collapse because there was no money. It collapsed because there were no workers. Land still existed. Tools still existed. Demand for food still existed. But the people who actually produced value were missing. This was the first time in history when human labor became scarce. And in economics, scarcity changes everything. When something becomes rare, its price goes up. That rule applies to gold, oil, and people. For the first time, ordinary workers realized something powerful. They need us more than we need them. Farmers started demanding higher wages. Builders refused to work for old pay. Skilled craftsmen became extremely valuable. A blacksmith was no longer just a worker. He was an asset. A farm laborer was no longer replaceable. He had leverage. This moment is important because it reveals something uncomfortable. The market was now deciding the value of human life. Not morality, not religion, not kings. Supply and demand. And for a brief moment in history, labor held the power. But here's the part most people don't understand. This shift scared the ruling class. Landowners were sitting on massive estates, but without workers, land was useless. A field without farmers produces nothing. A castle without servants cannot function. So the elites faced a nightmare scenario. They owned everything, but controlled nothing. This was the first crack in the old feudal system. And this crack forced the rich to think differently. Because once workers realize their value, the system becomes unstable. This is the exact moment where we see the beginning of a pattern that repeats throughout history. Crisis increases the value of labor temporarily, but long-term wealth flows back to ownership. At this stage, the rich were not richer yet. But they were learning, they were watching, they were planning how to make sure that even when workers became valuable again, power would never fully leave the hands of owners. This labor collapse was not just an economic shock, it was a warning. A warning that if people ever become rare again, if labor ever gains leverage again, the system itself would need to change to protect wealth at the top. And that is exactly what happened next. When labor became rare, wages started rising. But what most people don't realize is this. Higher wages didn't excite the ruling class. They terrified them. Because money in the hands of workers was never the danger. The danger was what money could eventually buy. Freedom, independence, ownership. So the elites didn't celebrate recovery, they prepared containment. Workers were asking for more pay because they finally had leverage. And for the first time, the system felt something it had never felt before: loss of control. Landowners were watching laborers refuse jobs. Craftsmen were choosing employers. Survivors were negotiating, not begging. This was not how the world was supposed to work. So power responded the only way it ever does when threatened: through law. Governments stepped in, not as neutral forces, but as shields for wealth. They didn't ask workers to calm down, they ordered them to. Wage caps were imposed, not suggestions, not guidelines, limits. In plain language, the message was brutal. You may be valuable, but you are not free. If a worker charged more than the legal wage, punishment followed. Fines erased savings, prison erased resistance, forced labor erased choice. The market was allowed to work everywhere, except where it threatened power. Food prices could rise, rent could rise, land prices could rise, but the price of human labor was frozen. This wasn't economic logic. This was control logic. Because controlling wages does something very specific. It keeps workers alive, but never comfortable, busy, but never independent. A worker who earns just enough to survive has no time to plan, no capital to invest, no leverage to leave. That is not an accident. That is design. The elites understood something fundamental. If workers ever saved enough, they would stop being workers. They would buy land. They would start businesses. They would exit dependence. And that could never be allowed. So wages were permitted to rise only within invisible walls, high enough to prevent rebellion, low enough to prevent escape. This is how power works. It doesn't crush people openly. It contains them quietly. And this is the pattern that repeats again and again in history. Crisis increases labor's value. Power responds by rewriting the rules. Workers gain income. Owners retain control. The plague didn't liberate workers. It revealed how quickly freedom is revoked the moment it becomes dangerous to the system. Once wages were contained, the elites faced a new problem. They still depended on labor, and dependence is weakness. You can cap wages, you can punish workers, you can freeze pay, but as long as production requires people, those people will always carry risk. So power began searching for something safer than labor, something permanent, something controllable, something that could not negotiate. They found it in land. The plague had wiped out entire families, not just workers, but small landowners. Fields had no heirs, homes had no claimants, farms sat abandoned. And abandoned assets are opportunities. Survivors needed food, tools, shelter, and security. But many lacked one thing: cash. Meanwhile, large landlords, nobles, and merchant elites had liquidity. They had stored wealth, they had access to credit, they had political protection. So they moved, quietly, legally, relentlessly. Land was bought cheaply, sometimes for pennies, sometimes in exchange for debt, sometimes seized under the cover of law. This wasn't conquest by armies, it was conquest by contracts. Small farmers who survived the plague often couldn't afford to restart. Seeds cost money, tools cost money, taxes never stopped, so they borrowed. And when they couldn't repay, the land changed hands. Not through violence, through paperwork. Workers had been prevented from earning enough to escape. Now land was being removed as an option altogether. This is where the real shift happened. Labor was no longer the center of wealth. Ownership was. Landowners realized something powerful. If you don't own the people, own the ground beneath them. A man without land must work. A man without land must rent. A man without land must obey market terms. And so farming began to change. Instead of independent farmers working their own land, fields were rented, sharecropping expanded, tenancy replaced ownership. The landlord no longer needed to manage production, he only needed to collect rent. This was the birth of passive income, money earned not by working, but by controlling access. Once land became a financial instrument, everything changed. Food was no longer just food. Housing was no longer just shelter. They became revenue streams. If workers had leverage before, they lost it here. Because now, refusing to work didn't mean starvation alone, it meant eviction. The risk shifted downward. Bad harvest? Tenant suffers. Economic shock? Tenant suffers. Landowner still collects. This structure is not ancient history. It is the foundation of modern wealth. Every real estate empire, every rental market, every housing monopoly traces its logic back to this moment. By the time wages were capped and land was consolidated, the equation was complete. Workers could earn, but they could not own. They could survive, but they could not escape. And once ownership was secured, the rich no longer needed to fear labor. They had replaced it.
This is where part 1 ends. The Black Death didn't bring equality. It brought instability. For a brief moment, workers had leverage, wages rose, choices expanded. And the moment that power felt real, the system reacted. Not with violence, with law. When rules are written to protect ownership, freedom quietly becomes conditional. What you've seen isn't ancient history, it's the blueprint. In part 2, we'll break down how wealth was permanently locked through inheritance, through restricted skills, and through ownership designed to exclude. If this changed the way you see money and power, hit the like button right now. Let's set the target at 10,000 likes. If this video hits that number, part 2 is coming. And it goes further than most people are comfortable with. Subscribe to the channel because the next chapter explains why the system still works this way today. History didn't fail us, it trained us.